National Security Advisor John Bolton arriving in Israel today to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two are expected to discuss the war in Syria just days after President Trump froze hundreds of millions of dollars to fund stabilization in parts of Syria taken back from ISIS because allies like Saudi Arabia are pitching in. Bolton says the administration wants to end Iran's involvement in the conflict while also rooting out ISIS.
The interest that we're pursuing in Syria and in Iraq is the final destruction of the ISIS territorial caliphate, dealing with the ISIS territorial threat, and getting Iran back into getting its forces back into its own territory. That's what we're focused on. We're obviously concerned about a number of things, including the humanitarian situation in the region.
Trey Yingst is reporting live from Jerusalem. And first of all, hi, Trey, and welcome to the family.
Well, thank you. That's right. Tonight, the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, is here in Israel. He's scheduled to have dinner with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and then he'll have a series of bilateral meetings tomorrow morning. Now, those meetings expected to focus on the reconstruction process on the ground in Syria. Additionally, the two slated to address rising tensions with Iran in the region. Right now, there are thousands of Iranian-backed troops currently stationed in Syria, and under an agreement between the Iranians and the Russians, those troops must remain at least 85 kilometers from the northern Israeli border. The current Israeli position on this issue is that those Iranian troops should not be there in the first place, and the Trump administration has echoed that very viewpoint. Now, it is important, though, to take a look at the timing of this meeting between Bolton and Netanyahu, because following his 48-hour stop in Israel, Bolton will head to Geneva, Switzerland this week to meet with his Russian counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev. This amid larger conversations with the Russians about the future of leadership in Syria. Now, when asked today by ABC News in an interview if Syrian President Bashar al-Assad staying in power was an acceptable position for the United States to agree to, Bolton responded saying the U.S. is focused on humanitarian aid in the region and also defeating the Islamic State. Now, while Bolton is discussing humanitarian aid and also the presence of Iranian troops in Syria, there is some tension here in Israel following a protest at the Israel-Gaza border on Friday that left 2 Palestinians dead and more than 100 injured.
Trey Yingst reporting in Jerusalem. Thanks, Trey.
And Trey, welcome to Fox News. Well, for more on this, let's bring in Christian Wyden. He's the former State Department senior advisor under Presidents Trump and George W. Bush. So, Christian, is the administration basically, do you think, abandoning Syria and just leaving it in the hands of Iran and Russia, or is this a wise direction?
I think it's a wise direction. It's not abandoning it, but the president has made clear all along, including during the campaign, he didn't want to get enmeshed in Syria beyond the primary goal, the primary threat to the United States, which is ISIS. He said all along, we're going to kill ISIS, and lo and behold, the U.S. military and our allies have done a pretty good job of killing off ISIS, just a little bit left. As far as managing the outcome of the Syrian civil war, what does Assad control, what do other people control, I think we're going to have a much lighter impact on that because, frankly, we have other interests elsewhere in the world. But Bolton and Trump have done something important, which is to cut back on U.S. assistance, which has been replaced actually by Saudi assistance. That makes a lot of sense, so that Saudi Arabia and other Sunni powers will have influence in Syria to counterbalance Iran and Russia.
You know, that's really important. So let's talk about that. Really, basically, an Arab coalition. The president has called for that in the past, for them to pony up more money, to get more involved in terms of troops. We've been doing all the heavy lifting all these years. Why is it so important for the Saudis and other Sunni Arab nations to finally, have some skin in the game themselves?
All right, if you look at what's going to become of Syria and Iraq, those geographies, which probably, the lines on the maps are less relevant, frankly, than they were before, or less permanent than they were before, you're going to have areas of influence. Assad, who's an evil man, and nonetheless has survived pretty well from a near-death experience going back to the beginning of the Arab Spring to where he is now, having control over great parts of Syria. As for what isn't going to be controlled by him, we're not going to be there forever. Frankly, we're looking to get out of other places after Afghanistan, after 17 years, Iraq for a very long time. So the people with the greatest national interest and the ability to link with Sunni forces there are the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, and they're willing to pay, and they're going to pay, so that just all makes the most sense.
And how does this affect Iran in terms of the demilitarized type border that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been wanting? He's met with the Russian president several times on this, and now that we know that John Bolton will be meeting with his Russian counterpart, do you think that they will stick to that line to keep Iranian-backed forces out of Israel's harm?
Yep, that is, I think, one of the key items on Bolton's agenda in meeting with the Russians. Incidentally, he'll also meet with the Ukrainians in Kiev to assure them that we continue to support them against any Russian incursion, further Russian incursion in their territory. But if you're Assad, if you survive this near-death experience, if you're a tyrant, you're going to want a sugar daddy to survive. And his choices are Iran or Russia or both. Our national interest after the death of ISIS in Syria and Iraq is to limit Iranian influence, limit their ability to spread terror around the world. And so to the extent we can cooperate with Russia, and Israel has shown that it can cooperate with Russia, that is good. We actually want some things from the Russians, which sort of makes you wonder why we have some of these sanctions on autopilot, which are getting worse and worse and worse by the month.
Well, it's because of their behavior and what Putin has done, that's why. And their Russian election interference.
It is, but for example, we just increased sanctions on Russia because of their attempts to assassinate 2 people in Britain, not just because they attempted to kill them, because they did with nerve agents. I know we'd feel much better if they had been stabbed or pushed out of windows instead, but we already had punished them. We had expelled 60 Russian diplomats and closed a consulate here, and yet we just increased the number of sanctions. And in November, unless they do a mea culpa, we're going to cancel Aeroflot flights to the United States and start cutting diplomatic relations, typically what you do before you go to war with the country. So, you know, I just think it's important to say we want things from the Russians, and so we might want to talk to them and might not want to put them in the same category as North Korea or other countries like China that pose a very serious threat.
Well, they are in the same category when they go and try and kill their people who've defected, especially with chemical weapons and agents that have been banned since World War I. So let's leave it at that. Christian, good to see you.